Hello, I'm Mike Leiderman. Welcome to the program. The world has recently concluded celebrating the centennial of the birth of David Ben-Gurion. For those who didn't know or might have forgotten, the centennial was an opportunity to rekindle the memory of the man who was Israel's first prime minister and whose work and whose visions were invaluable to the formation of the Jewish state of Israel. That was in 1948, of course, following the near destruction of Jewry by the Nazis. Shabtai Teveth has been immersed in Ben-Gurion for the last, decade and a half or so. He has been writing a multi-volume biography of the man who has been called Israel's George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and a lot of other less complimentary names by other people. Mr. Teveth, you've studied David Ben-Gurion, as we said, for 13, 14 years. You've talked to other leaders about him. You've certainly written extensively about him. After all of this, what is your opinion of the man? Two ways, as a world leader and as a human being.
Well, as a world leader, I think he was unique. He did what no other leader before him ever did. He was trying to give the Jewish people a central government, something that the great Moses and even a higher instance failed to do. He was partially successful, but even so, his place in history is secured. As an individual, I thought, and this is what I like about him very much, that he was equal to one and all were equal to him. He was a man who could talk to a 10-year-old boy, to a guard, the gate of the Prime Minister's office, to the American ambassador, to the Queen of England, as if they were all the same person.
You have been working on this book for a long time. But before you wrote this book, you did a biography of Moshe Dayan, who really came after Ben-Gurion. And the reason why, you told me, was that Dayan was a much more easily saleable publisher's dream as opposed to Ben-Gurion. And yet, when you talk about the comparison between what each has done, how do you compare what the two men have done?
Oh, there is no comparison. They're not in the same school. They're not in the same school. Ben-Gurion's life, first of all, I mean, people like records. Ben-Gurion could enter the Guinness Book of Records on many counts. Let's take one for endurance, for example. He lived 87 years. Dayan died when he was not 70. Ben-Gurion held central office for 66 years. Now, no one in a democratic system held such an office that long. Churchill would be a runner-up, wouldn't be considered a very serious competitor. Ben-Gurion started writing his diary when he was 14, and unfortunately, this diary, until the year 1919, he was born 1886, and he started writing the diary when he was 14, that was 1900. But the first 9 years of the diary were lost in a house fire. But we have his diaries since 1919 to the very last day he lived. Now again, this is a record. Then as posthumous papers are concerned, or presidential libraries, he left behind him 750,000 items in what would be the presidential library. Again, this is unequaled, it's unmatched.
Does that make your job easier or more difficult, having so much material about the man, much of it written by himself?
Well, there are several ways of looking at it. Let me put it this way. Some great people, outstanding people, as a matter of fact, all people try to embellish their lives, try to cosmeticize. They don't want others to see them not in the light that they would prefer them to see them. So political leaders so often would cosmeticize their lives by destroying evidence, or in some countries by destroying tapes, or destroying letters. Whereas Ben-Gurion chose the other way. He wanted to befuddle his biographer by over-flooding him with material. You know, what one might say that for the trees you can't see the forest.
Mm-hmm. So you would have to wade through a whole lot of material to try to throw you off the track that way.
Yes, because, I mean, suppose you read his diaries. Now, his diaries were not something where he poured his heart to posterity. The diaries in themselves are a riddle or a mystery. On one hand, they served day-to-day Edmund Miranda. I mean, something to help his memory. They could be seen as a mobile archive. He'd write the diaries on the day, he would enter everything on the day it did happen. He'd meet you, and while you talked to him, he'd put down what you told him and what he answered you. This was real-time diaries. Well, then you ask yourself the question, what did he put in his diaries? Did he put all of what you told him, or all of what he answered you?
Was it informational? Was it opinion?
Oh, here it is. I mean, surely intended it for history. But while he was doing his diaries, writing his diaries, he was already editing them, because he never changed them later. Well, some people, and I've seen such diaries, that one writes a diary, and then a year later he changes his mind and thinks, well, maybe this is not so complimentary for me. Then he'd change, he'd rewrite, he'd cut out, he'd erase. In one case I know of an Israeli very famous party leader who, with a very fine razor, cut out some lines out of his diary. This wasn't Ben-Gurion doing. He never would do such a thing. He'd never stoop to do such a thing, having such self-respect for himself. He say, I'm Ben-Gurion, I don't need to do that thing at all. So he never do that. Mm-hmm. But he was able, apparently, to edit the diaries while he was doing it.
A human word processor, if you will.
A kind of a human processor, but a one-time processor. You know?
He never went back.
He never went back.
It's interesting. He seemed, from reading your book and other material, here's a man who seemed to have a vision almost from the time he was born. He knew what he wanted to do. And he got this from his father, from his grandfather, from his family. I mean, he was ready to go to Palestine at the age of 6, it seemed.
Well, he claimed that he was a born Zionist, because a very frequent question is, what led Ben-Gurion to become a Zionist? I mean, making a parallel to Herzl. Then Herzl was a Viennese journalist, novelist, and then he went to Paris to cover the Dreyfus trial. And it was the Dreyfus trial that made a Zionist out of him. As a matter of fact, changed his life and changed the life of the Jewish people at the same time.
Theodor Herzl we're talking about.
We're talking about Theodor Herzl. Mm-hmm. And people would like to draw parallels from it and say, here was Herzl, and these are the events that led Herzl to Zionism. And then they'd ask, what were the events that led Ben-Gurion to Zionism? And the answer would be none, because Ben-Gurion regarded himself as a born Zionist. And why? Because Zionism is founded on 3 elements: the love of the Bible, the love of Hebrew, and the love of Eretz Israel. And Ben-Gurion, a bright kid he was, a bright baby he was, his grandfather started teaching him Hebrew while he was 2 or 3 years old on his lap. Then grandfather used to read the Bible every night before he went to sleep, and he passed this habit completely to Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion in his lifetime read the Bibles over and over again many a time. So there was the love of Hebrew, the love of the Bible, and Ben-Gurion could speak Hebrew before he could speak Jewish or Polish or Russian, that were the languages used in his father's house. And finally, when he was a young kid, he was taken to the synagogue, and he was shown the Aron HaKodesh, the Aron HaTorah, on which there were engraved fruits of the Holy Land. And he was asked, what are these fruits? And he was told these are the fruits of Eretz Israel. And he said that when he was told that, he said he didn't like these engravings, and he said he wanted to go there and see this wonderful fruit in his own eyes in Palestine. So when he was 3 years old, Ben-Gurion said he was a mature Zionist.
At the age of 3. He left for Palestine before he was 20.
Right.
And he went with the idea that that he was, what, going to build a Jewish state there? Did he know what he was going into? Did he go there to, he worked the land, that was his goal, to work the land. But did he see himself as the leader of a Jewish state by the time he was 15, 16, 18?
Well, you're asking me whether Ben-Gurion felt destined to such a mission, and the answer is yes. Now, what brought about this feeling of destiny and sense of destiny, this we know for sure. When he was 18 years old and naive and honest and not knowledgeable about the politicians' ways or how you hide your objective, he wrote letters to his friend Fuchs, and these letters reveal that he felt some urge inside him. He didn't know what this urge was. And he said, maybe it's a love to a woman, the love to a girl. He met a girl he thought he was in love with for about 6 years prior to this letter. And then he said, no, it's not a love to a woman, it's something else. I feel an urge. And then after a few more letters, he says, this is the urge to do things on a large scale, or grand design, as he called it, to use his own words. He felt he wanted to achieve something beyond any other thing. Let me draw here a parallel. As I see him as a genius, I'd like to make a parallel to another genius. For example, Beethoven. When he was a young boy, and the family was still living in Bonn before they moved to Vienna. Beethoven was looking out of the window, and his grandmother, whom he loved very much, took a farewell. And Beethoven's mother called young Ludwig and said, well, come here, Ludwig, and say a goodbye to your grandmother, the grandmother you love so much. And the little Beethoven wouldn't come. And then his mother asked him again and again, and grandmother left. Then Beethoven's mother told him, why didn't you come to say goodbye to your grandmother? And he said, Mother, I've been seeing such beautiful images. I couldn't tear myself away. Had you seen these beautiful images, you wouldn't have come yourself. Now, these images were the musical ideas, the first musical ideas that I think so entered Beethoven's mind. The same way, certain ideas, certain thoughts entered Ben-Gurion's mind without him knowing what and how to call them. So he thought maybe this urge is a love for a woman. Maybe it's the urge to do something big. He was not then sure that he was going to become a Jewish leader.
He had such power among Jews worldwide when he went into Palestine, organizing there the Histadrut, moving into worldwide Zionism. He would travel throughout Europe and the United States, into America, organizing there. When the government came to be formed, obviously he was at the forefront. And yet, you wonder where the motives were, that the motives were the grand design, a bigger plan. But he still had the practical sense, it seemed, to be in the right place at the right time, to be elected, to work both ends against the middle so that he could survive politically. And this fascinates me, that, that he could do that.
Well, because there is politics in everything. There is politics in everything. I mean, let's go back to music again. I mean, if you want to be the composer, played and no one, and not anyone else, you need politics. I mean, there was a famous movie here, Amadeus. A lot of politics was played there. I mean, Salieri wouldn't let Mozart become the favored court composer. Right. So there is this politics, there is this egoism or egocentrism, surely. Ben-Gurion thought all these great things, but at the same time, he wanted to be the one to execute.
How did he do that? How did he control? There were so many other leaders at the time. There was Weizmann, there was Jabotinsky, there were several, the Katzenelson. And they were all vying essentially for the same thing. How did he, with his short stature, come up head and shoulders above everyone else?
Well, the toughest rival, by far, was Weizmann. Let's take them one by one. Katzenelson weakened over the years. Katzenelson was unable to do any pragmatic, day-to-day politicking. He was not very wise about creating a machine and then maintaining this machine. he was more a man of ideas.
Yes.
But even so, he started weakening. He weakened because there were a trio. There was Tabenkin, who led the kibbutz movement. There was Ben-Gurion, who led the party as such. And Katzenelson was caught in the middle. Now, the thing was that Ben-Gurion predicted European tragedy or destruction prior to anyone else. He was seized by a great sense of urgency in the 1920s. He thought while history made the emergence of Zionism possible, at the same time, it restricted the time it allowed for its implementation. And he was seized by this sense of urgency. In August 1933, he bought a copy of Mein Kampf, and he read it. He's one of the very few Zionists that read it, let alone bought a copy, because Hitler was not to be touched then. And in January 1934, he starts warning European Jewry and Jews all over the world that Hitler was after them to destroy them, and they must be rescued while there was still time. Now, this sense of urgency with his premonition about Hitler combined to a sense of the burning ground, hence the name of the book. Ben-Gurion felt as if the ground was burning and something must be done while there was still time to save the Jews of Europe. Tabenkin did not think so. Now, in order to do that, to rescue the Jews of Germany, Ben-Gurion was ready to compromise on many values, on Zionist values and on labor Zionist values. Tabenkin, heading the kibbutz movement, did not think that the tragedy was so near. He thought there was more time. Therefore, he objected to Ben-Gurion's trying to take over the Zionist organization in a democratic way, and insisting that the labor movement would be not a party, a voters' party, but implementers' party. People would go to the kibbutzim, would be frontiers people, people who would live on the value of Zionism and social Zionism, and not try to get the votes of Jewry in Europe, by which they might deface the pioneering image of labor Zionism. In order to become the majority party in the Zionist organization, Ben-Gurion needed the votes of the middlemen in Warsaw, or the kiosk owners in Nalewka Street in Warsaw, because Poland had 1/3 of the Zionist votes. Tabenkin objected to it, saying if we will woo such voters, they will not come to the kibbutz. We are losing something very important. And he wouldn't agree to what Ben-Gurion wanted, to turn the Zionist movement into a mass immigration movement to rescue the Jews of Europe. Whereas Tabenkin wanted a very selective immigration, only of people who were dedicated in the labor Zionist ideas, would go to a kibbutz, would become frontiers people. This was Tabenkin. Now, Katzenelson didn't find his place between those two. Either one of them took a very definite position, and Katzenelson was weakening, especially that most of the youth, Zionist youth of the time, of the labor youth, tended to follow Tabenkin.
Mm-hmm. Let's skip ahead for a bit. I don't mean to cut you short.
I'm sorry.
But you know, we've got so much ground to cover.
Right.
But the person you said who was his greatest rival was Chaim Weizmann, who became first president of Israel. But in a sense, his becoming first president of Israel was almost a parting gift for him. Ben-Gurion was really the man with the power. How did Ben-Gurion play that one?
Well, that was a very tough one to play, because in many respects, Weizmann was superior to Ben-Gurion, and Ben-Gurion knew that.
In terms of what, academics?
To begin with, I mean, looks. Weizmann was a tall, broad-shouldered man, stately, and Ben-Gurion was short and not thought by a great many people to be particularly handsome.
Sure.
Weizmann was. Weizmann had a magic about him. He had
The British refinements.
no, and he had a spell. He could throw a spell over people. And Ben-Gurion later became charismatic, but at that time was not particularly attractive to people who did not know him closely. Weizmann was an academic with a world reputation as a chemist. Weizmann was rich. He could live off the patents that he invented in World War I. And besides, he had a very, very strong support from the Lord Ziff and Lord Marx, the owners of Marks and Spencer. The Anglo-Zionist group that was rich, refined, stood by him. The aristocracy in England, the British government, all the political community in England accepted Weizmann as the spokesman of the Jews. I must add that the way that the British crowned some chiefs over some tribes in Africa, in nearly the same way, they decided that Weizmann was the prince of the Jews. Once they treated him as the prince of the Jews, well, the Jews said, okay, we have a prince. Now, he was a very hard act to follow because no one thought of Ben-Gurion as a prince. This was very difficult, very difficult.
Ben-Gurion was more like the frog, right?
Well, who'd kiss him?
Right. We'll get to that later, but go ahead.
Well, but then Ben-Gurion said that Weizmann was a disaster to Zionism because when it be among his British lords, the friends and aristocracy, then in order to please them for the jest, he'd compromise and he'd not insist on Zionist objectives. Ben-Gurion said that Weizmann had no political sense. And very slowly and gradually, he started to prove that. This was a very long process. But let me give you one example. First, that Ben-Gurion foresaw the Hitler tragedy years before Weizmann. And then in 1938, Ben-Gurion said that America would assume a world role that would increase vastly in the years to come. Weizmann at that time was still an Anglophile, and he thought that everything was going to be within the sphere of influence of Great Britain. And Ben-Gurion started coming to this country every year since 1938. He came here 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. And his points were becoming recognized by his own by his own party first, because his own party was not giving him its full support. It was supporting Weizmann. But from 1940-41, when so many of Ben-Gurion's prophecies were fulfilled, he started gaining the trust and faith of first his own party, then the Zionist movement, and then the Jewish people at large.
Was he undercutting Weizmann at the same time, or was he just trying to prove his own theories?
No, he was undercutting him in what many people thought was a very ungentlemanly way. This happened in this country in June 1942. Ben-Gurion at that time said, either you're going to sack Weizmann or I'm going to resign. There was a meeting at Rabbi Stevens Wise office in Manhattan, in New York, and all present voted for Weizmann. And Ben-Gurion went back to Jerusalem and told the Zionist Actions Committee there, if you don't fire Weizmann, then I'm going to resign. And it took him 4 years until finally, in December 1946, Weizmann was not re-elected to be president of the Zionist Congress and the Zionist World Organization. So you ask why? Because this man had the guts to do so. It was a question of guts, question of political genius, of knowing what's going to happen. And besides, there was one very important point that must be said in favor of Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion was dead right about one thing. Weizmann was not the leader to lead the Jewish people through this period of the Holocaust and of the struggle in Palestine against the British. You needed a war leader, someone with guts made of brass, and that was Ben-Gurion. And he was right about that. Mm-hmm. And he knew that he was the man and no one else.
Yitzhak Navon, who worked very closely with Ben-Gurion, likened him to Moses and David. He said, I admit this sounds a little bit broad now, a little bit more than most people can handle, but as decades and centuries go by, he will be thought of in those terms. Do you concur?
No, I don't think so. I think that in every nation there is a time for legend and for myth. And Moses, David, they are part of a myth. Now, there was no recorded history at the time. Only myths were recorded as if there were history. Nowadays, we live in an age that is well documented, if not over documented. Every little cuff, every little mistake, every little slip is recorded and magnified. And then there are schools of thought. Some say Ben-Gurion was great, others would say that Jabotinsky was great. Jabotinsky died in 1940, therefore he never was a rival to Ben-Gurion. I don't think that Ben-Gurion, given the documentation we have today, would ever become part of a tetrad of Moses, David, and David I and David II.
How about Churchill, Roosevelt?
Well, yes, this club he did enter. This club it did enter. But just the same as I don't think that Churchill would ever be thought of as a King Arthur, but he could be thought in the company, taken in the company of Oliver Cromwell. Same thing I would say that Ben-Gurion was a member of this club of Churchill, Roosevelt, Adenauer, and de Gaulle.
The book is called Ben-Gurion, The Burning Ground. It is the story of Ben-Gurion from his birth until the founding of the State of Israel. And you've got more on the way, true? You're going to take it up to through 1973 eventually, through his death?
No, this volume is the volume called The Burning Ground. This is it. Now, because of archival problems in Israel, a second volume or a continuation is more problematic. And I don't know when, if I'll do this, and if I do this, then when. We have a 30-year ban on every state document. But some categories, like in Great Britain, like in this country, are not to be open for even 50 years and 100 years, and sometimes not to be open forever. If these categories will be open to me, even partly, then I'll be ready to go on researching.
When you're through, please come back.
Well,
okay.
This would be the bicentennial of Ben-Gurion.
Probably.
I'll be very glad to meet you, Mike.
Okay, we'll be here. Shabtai, Teveth, thank you very much for being with us. Again, the book is called Ben-Gurion, The Burning Ground, 1886 to 1948. I'm Mike Leiderman. Thank you for watching.